All right, so are you ready to plunge into a true classic with me? Today, we're going deep, really deep, into Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to
Oh,
Arms.
a fantastic choice, really.
You're interested in going beyond just scratching the surface of this book,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And you came to the right place because, believe me, we are about to uncover some seriously interesting stuff today.
I think listeners are in for a real treat with this one. A Farewell to Arms, it's more than just a war story, you see. This is Hemingway at his most raw and personal love, loss, disillusionment, all set against the incredibly vivid backdrop of World War I Italy.
And speaking of Hemingway, before we even get to the trenches themselves, I think it would help to get a feel for the man behind those famous words.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, picture this. Hemingway as a young man, volunteering as an ambulance driver in Italy, right in the thick of the war. Yeah, and that experience, the rawness of it, the brutality, really just fundamentally shaped his writing. He developed this incredibly concise style, almost journalistic, you could say, where every single word carries so much weight. You see those themes, masculinity, war, the search for meaning, in pretty much all of his work. But they're never more potent, more, well, raw than in A Farewell to Arms.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of World War I, Hemingway's unmistakable style.
Yeah.
Now let's introduce the characters who really breathe life into this story. Who are they, and how do they pull us into this world he creates?
Right. From that very first page, we're introduced to Frederick Henry, an American serving as an ambulance driver, just like Hemingway himself, in the Italian army. And just like Hemingway, Frederick is suddenly thrown into this chaotic world of war, navigating trenches and field hospitals in a country being torn apart around him. Then we meet Catherine Barclay.
Ah, Catherine.
She's a British nurse, and she enters Frederick's life and quickly becomes, well, you could call her a beacon of light in the darkness surrounding them.
It's interesting how Hemingway seems to almost blur that line between fiction and reality. I mean,
Right.
was their love story also inspired by his own life?
It's kind of uncanny, really. Just like Hemingway himself, you see, who, as you know, had this passionate but ultimately tragic love affair with a nurse while he was recovering from injuries during the war. Frederick finds this incredible solace in Catherine's arms. And their love story, it's so fascinating because it unfolds against a backdrop of just unimaginable suffering, a cholera epidemic, the brutal Battle of Caporetto, the chaotic retreat of the Italian army. And Hemingway doesn't just, mention these events as an afterthought. He places their love story directly in the path of history, using those real-life events to really heighten the stakes.
Now, that is a really, really interesting point because it makes their search for love and connection even more powerful, even more essential, knowing everything they're up against. But speaking of challenges, this is World War I we're talking about here. It's not exactly a walk in the park. How does Hemingway portray the reality of war alongside this, well, burgeoning romance?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine, right? Finding love in the middle of so much destruction, so much despair. Did Hemingway portray that contrast directly, or is it more of an underlying thing?
Well, he does both, actually. And I think that's part of what makes the novel so compelling.
Yes, definitely.
There's this passage in book 3 during the collapse of the Italian front in Frederick. He describes the scene as, get this, like a messy country fair.
Soldiers, civilians, they're all just fleeing for their lives, just utter chaos. And yet, in the midst of this complete and utter breakdown, Frederick is just so acutely aware of Catherine, her presence, her hand in his. It's just this brilliant juxtaposition, the epic scale of the tragedy of war against this very intimate, very personal experience of love and fear.
It's incredible. He manages to capture both of those things at the same time, the vastness of it all and then the individual impact on the people caught up in it all. But I mean, knowing the history here and Hemingway's own life,
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine this love story ending happily ever after, you know what I mean?
Yeah, you're right to sense that kind of impending doom, that feeling that something bad's coming. And remember those themes of disillusionment we talked about
As
earlier?
I do, yeah.
Well, as Frederick sees more and more of the war's brutality, his idealism is chipped away, bit by bit. It's not even just the physical danger, it's the senselessness of it, the loss of life, the hope just draining away the questioning of everything he thought he once believed in. There's a point where Frederick's talking about the war, and he says, I was always embarrassed by the words sacred, glorious, and sacrifice. And this wasn't just a personal feeling that Hemingway had, but it reflected this broader sense of disillusionment that really took hold after the war.
So it seems like Frederick's starting to see through the propaganda, right?
Mm.
Questioning why they were even fighting in the first place.
Yeah.
Did that cynicism, that doubt, did that start to affect his relationship with Catherine?
You bet it did. I mean, it's subtle. But Hemingway is a master of subtext. He shows how Frederick's growing cynicism colors how he sees everything, even love. Frederick becomes withdrawn. He starts to question if happiness is even possible in a world as messed up as this.
So you have this incredible tension building this deep, passionate love, but it's threatened by the war, by disillusionment. It sounds like Hemingway is setting the stage for a powerful and probably tragic ending.
You're really reading between the lines there, which of course is exactly what Hemingway wants you to do. He's a master of saying more with less. He uses these carefully chosen details, stark descriptions, to evoke this world of emotion. It's what he doesn't say that often leaves the biggest mark.
That reminds me of the iceberg theory. It's often used to describe his writing. Could you explain that a bit?
Sure. The iceberg theory suggests that the real depth of the story is hidden beneath the surface. Like an iceberg, right, where you only see a small part of it above the water. Hemingway gives you just enough to grasp the basics of the story. But the real meaning, the emotional weight, it's in what's submerged, the unspoken feelings, the things left unsaid.
It's like he gives you just enough to build the rest yourself in your mind, to really feel those things that aren't actually on the page.
That's it, exactly. And that's what makes A Farewell to Arms so powerful, especially that ending.
Oh, yeah.
Without giving anything away, how does Hemingway bring those threads together? The love, the loss, the disillusionment in the final act of the novel.
Well, remember how we were talking about that feeling of impending doom?
I do, yeah.
Well, let's just say that feeling, it really comes to a head. The ending, it's definitely a punch to the gut. Hemingway doesn't shy away from tragedy at all. He uses it to really drive home the fragility of hope, the lasting wounds that war leaves on people, on their spirits.
It's interesting you say that because there are so many different ways to see that ending. Some people, they see it as this bleak commentary on the futility of hope, while others, they see a glimmer of maybe not hope, but resilience, in the face of just devastating loss. But
Yeah.
no matter how you interpret it, that ending is, well, it's proof of Hemingway's power as an author to make you think, to stick with you long after you finish the book.
It's one of those endings you can't shake. It makes
Yeah.
you want to go back and reread,
Yeah.
see those moments in a new light, knowing how it all turns out,
Hmm.
to try to find those hidden depths.
That's what makes great literature. Well, great, right. It stays with you. It sparks new questions, new insights, even years later. And that's why, why A Farewell to Arms still resonates with readers almost 100 years after it was written. It's so much more than just a war story. It's this timeless story about love, about loss, about trying to find meaning when the world feels chaotic.
It makes you wonder how the story would be different today. What if Frederick and Catherine were falling in love, but in the middle of a modern conflict?
Oh, wow, what a question. Would their love survive things like drone warfare, the threat of terrorism, the psychological pressures of war today? It's hard to know for sure, but it definitely adds a whole new layer to the story.
It does. It's amazing how a book written so long ago can still feel so relevant, so current. That seems like a good place to leave it for today, with a newfound respect for just how powerful Hemingway's writing is, and maybe a few questions to ponder. Until next time, everyone, keep exploring.